won't we listen? Why won't we listen? Why do we turn away from those who we should be listening to? Why is listening to another's story or perspective or experience so difficult sometimes? I used to recite the prayer for peace that's attributed to St. Francis of Assisi every morning, asking that God make me an instrument of peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled than to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. This prayer reminds us that the world needs us. The world needs us to listen to one another, but not just listen. Be genuinely curious to hear about very different experiences and realities. Hear about the hatred that they experience. Hear about the injuries that they have suffered. Listen. Do they struggle with doubt and despair? Are they trudging through the darkness of the world, unable to see the light, unable to feel joy? Are they in need of consoling? Can we listen and try to understand? Can we listen and show them love? Or do we use the conversation to talk about ourselves and our feelings and not actually listen? I'm sure that you have been in the same situation that I have been in on numerous occasions, where you're speaking with someone and you pick up on that they are really more interested in telling you their story than listening to what you have to say. A part of showing empathy is recognizing that we have commonalities, shared experiences, but a larger part is actively listening with curiosity to another person's story, with the understanding that even though you have experienced a similar event, there is no way that we could fully know the feelings of another, because each person's experience is unique. We do not assume that we know what another person is feeling. We do not assume that we know anything about that person honestly. We can engage in what is called the beginner's mind. The beginner's mind is a Zen meditation practice, a Zen Buddhist practice of going into a conversation with no preconceived notions about the person that we are conversing with. We keep our minds open, which sometimes means being willing to change our way of thinking and grow from the story of another. Being open-minded can be tough. We are brought up with a set of values and beliefs and biases. And throughout our lives, we tend to surround ourselves with people who share the same values and the same beliefs. Children have beginner's mind. Children definitely have beginner's mind. They ask way more questions than adults do, and they very rarely abide by the implied social rules on how to satisfy their curiosity. Adults are probably not going to walk up to a man in a wheelchair in a grocery store and say, "Hey, why are you in a wheelchair? What happened to you?" Or if we see someone crying at a bus stop, we probably won't just go sit next to them, look them in the face and say, "Why are you crying? What's wrong?" I've witnessed children do both of these things and have been embarrassed by their bluntness, but also envious of how curious they are, how hungry they are to know more about other people. And they have yet to develop any bias. Bias is a preference in favor of or against a person or a group of people or a thing. These reactions are often unconscious, and are rooted in inaccurate information. These biases can be a roadblock for us as we try to listen and learn about one another. Could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through the eyes of another for an instant? During our meditation video, which, by the way, I've seen several times and I cry every time I see it. But in that video, we watched as the camera wanders around, mostly in a hospital setting, and it looks into the inner lives of people. And there's so much worry and sadness in the hospital. There's bad news, and there's good news, and there's no news. I think that might be the worst sometimes. Not getting any news at all and not knowing what is happening. But there's also joy, and there is anxiety, and there is fear, as in real life, but kind of magnified when you're in a hospital. We all carry our stories inside of us, and we have feelings that are not visible or obvious. After my mother died, not of COVID, but during the time of COVID, when hospital visitation was limited and there were other COVID protocols, there were days I wish I had a t-shirt that said, "I am in mourning, my mother just died." So people would treat me with a little more compassion, a little more patience and understanding. But not even a t-shirt would have been enough, because the grief, my grief, is different from other people's grief. Losing a loved one during the pandemic was a unique and awful, just awful experience that many people don't fully understand. I was blessed enough that my father and my brothers and I were able to be with my mother as she passed, but many families were not given that opportunity. And so we need to listen to their stories. When people learn that my mother died, there is often a softening and a connection. And sometimes it is empathy, and sometimes it is sympathy. And these are two different things. I get the empathy, especially when I meet someone who has recently lost their mom or recently lost someone, or even not so recently, because from what I hear, it is a grief that I will be carrying with me for the rest of my life. It just changes a little bit. I want us to take a moment. I have another video I want us to watch. It's a short video on the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sociologist Brené Brown has done an extensive amount of work on this subject: vulnerability, empathy, sympathy. And this video does an excellent job explaining the difference. So let's watch.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had a, yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Now try it.
Okay. Is that all right? Are we good?
There you go.
All right, yay. That's okay.
Back to our regular scheduled program.
Back to our regularly scheduled programming sermon. So, as I was saying, empathetic curiosity involves trying to understand another person's world from the inside out. And I know many of us struggle with showing empathetic curiosity towards people who do not share our values. How exactly do we communicate with family members, co-workers, friends, etc., whose political views are so very different? So I brought this up last night to a friend of mine. So I was talking about my sermon, and I, bouncing some ideas off. And as soon as I mentioned this, her body got tense. I could see like an anger, because what I was suggesting is that we love people who do not share our values. And we see that they too have fears and hopes and doubts and pain, that they are not all evil monsters. And she responded with a hefty dose of skepticism and a big, significant rolling of her eyes. I want to point out here that, and I want to be clear, that being curious does not mean that you are agreeing with the person that you are talking to. Neither are you condoning their behavior. You are merely listening to what they have to say without defensiveness, which can be difficult. Also, there are definitely times we must separate ourselves from people in our lives that mistreat us, or hurt us. That has to happen. But in many situations, we can resolve conflict by feeling empathy, which leads to genuine communication and healing. Empathetic curiosity is a spiritual practice. We must be honest with ourselves about who we possibly lack empathy for. Perhaps it is extremists. Perhaps it is drug addicts. Perhaps it is billionaires. I've seen that a lot recently. There's a lot of lack of empathy for people that got a lot of money. Conspiracy theorists, perhaps. Perhaps you don't have empathy for conspiracy theorists, or very fundamentalist religious folks. Perhaps. Perhaps it's your brother or your sister, or your dad, there's a good chance that there's someone in your family that you might lack a little bit of empathy for. When we recognize whomever is in our life that we might possibly be avoiding, we can try to put ourselves in their shoes and open ourselves to learning more about their story. Connection. Empathetic curiosity also plays an important role in creating a more just society, a more equal society. When I was an undergrad in religious studies at the University of South Florida, we spent a lot of time focusing on welcoming the stranger. And my classes were made up of students from all different religious backgrounds. And so we talked about this, and it was more than welcoming the stranger. When I speak of the stranger, I talk about folks that are different religion, nationality, sexual orientation, race, whatever. We not only welcome them, but we provide them with a safe space to share their story so we can learn about their experience. This can have a huge impact on uniting our world. I read about a program that was set up to help Palestinians and Israelis connect, and it was a telephone number that you called, and on one line would be an Israeli, and on the other line would be a Palestinian. And the main focus, the whole point of it, was just to have people talking to one another, learning about each other, being curious, just regular citizens, being curious about the other person's life. And there was one call, and it was a mother whose child was killed by an Israeli soldier. And she was talking to a mother whose child was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber. And they shared that pain of losing a child in this ongoing violent conflict. There was a commonality, and that helped the mothers communicate and connect. When we listen to marginalized groups, it becomes easier to understand that certain people have privileges that others do not. Your privileges are things that give you special status and that you didn't really earn, and you don't necessarily realize that you benefit from. One example is when white people, unlike African Americans, don't worry about police violence at a routine traffic stop. Another is when someone raised with enough money has never thought about whether or not they can afford to eat. So there is big empathetic curiosity we engage in as a way to tackle our huge social problems like poverty, oppression, racism. And there is empathetic curiosity on a smaller level that we can use in our individual day-to-day lives, not just in situations of conflict, but as a means to deepen our relationships with one another and help each other feel like we are seen. What are some ways that we can practice empathetic curiosity? The first and most important way is to listen. Listen. But more than that, we must be curious. We listen from our heart. We pay attention without interrupting. That's tough. That's a tough one. We got to let the other person dominate the conversation because we are listening. We are curious about that person. Even when we disagree with what they are saying, we ask open-ended questions neutrally with no emotional charge or contradictory body language from the asker. That's a thing you gotta be aware of. You show genuine interest. This will encourage the responder to go deeper into their story. Questions like, what is your biggest fear? So open-ended questions, there's no yes or no. It's actually you are trying to encourage them to tell you about their lives. What is your biggest fear? What makes you really angry? What is something people would look at you and then never guess about you? And what's the hardest challenge that you've had to overcome? if at all possible, avoid statements. So watch out that your brain isn't inserting what you feel or say based on your own personal experience, but rather you are fully seeking to understand another. Experiences are earned, meaning yours is not the same as another person's. Take what is being shared without inserting yourself into the mix. Ask yourself, just think about this. After you have shared a difficult experience with someone, you've just shared a very difficult experience with someone, would you rather have your friend tell you how this is exactly like what they went through and continue to talk about themselves? Or would you rather have that same friend ask you to share the impact it had on you? Ask you what you need in this moment and ask you how they can help. This will help them feel cared for. It takes courage. It takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable and share one's story. So when someone does share with you, tell them that you appreciate them, that they trusted you. They trusted you with their, what I call their sacred story, and assure them that you will keep it in confidence. You can say to them, this is a difficult situation, and I think you've shown a lot of courage and strength in how you're handling it. You can ask clarifying questions. For example, from what I am hearing, this is kind of like a nonviolent communication thing. From what I am hearing, you are feeling blank, sad, frustrated, angry, confused, scared, whatever. Is that right? And then that gives them the opportunity to say, yes or no, this is actually how I'm feeling. So by reiterating the reasons for why they are feeling the way they do, you can ensure that you understand the situation correctly, and you let them know that their experience is heard. Do not give unsolicited advice. Do not give unsolicited advice. Do not give unsolicited advice. I know it's tempting, especially if you feel there is a practical solution that would resolve their issue. But a lot of time, people really just need you to listen. Or maybe they're not ready to take action. They just need someone to hold space, to hold their sacred story. As a chaplain, that's my job. I've had patients share their stories with me, and some have asked for advice, but they ask questions that I don't really have an answer for. I'm just going to throw this in there. Y'all might relate. One of the biggest questions that people ask me, because I minister to people of all different faith traditions, is, am I going to hell? Y'all be surprised how many people ask me that. Now, as a Unitarian Universalist, my answer is obviously a big fat no, but because I minister to people of various traditions, I can't just, it's not about what I believe, it's about what they believe. So I ask them curiosity questions to figure out, why are they asking that? What is on their mind? Or what is prompting that question? Apparently, though, some religions think that ministers have a direct line to God, and we have all the answers. To be fair, I don't have a direct line, but I do have her email address, and only for emergencies. Her email is really backed up, though, like lots. As I've mentioned, this is a practice. It is a practice that we cultivate, and it is not easy. It might be emotionally painful, and it is definitely messy, and it can be uncomfortable. So over the past 2 weeks, what I have done is I have been trying to approach situations with this type of empathetic curiosity. I meant to put this on here. So I have this tattoo on it's a bee, and then I have this line underneath it, and I write things on there for whatever I need to be that day, like generous or patient, so I've had be curious on my arm for the past few weeks. so I could go into conversations with a little more curiosity and a little less of a know-it-all attitude, which I tend to have. And it has been challenging. It has been challenging. Now I'm doing this with family and friends. They're great to practice on. And I've almost mastered this with patients. Because it's my occupation, it's much easier to ask curiosity questions of a stranger than it is of a family member. It's especially like my little brother. He drives me absolutely bonkers. And I realize that I need to be more curious about why he behaves the way he behaves. So I encourage you to spend the next few weeks approaching situations and people with empathy. Observe with curiosity the present moment. Put yourself and your perspective aside, put it aside, and start to look through the eyes of others. Empathetic, thoughtful, and respectful listening creates a feeling of safety. The healing power of empathetic and compassionate listening should never be underestimated. May it be so. And now, if you will rise in singing our closing hymn, number